And I realized I forgot to turn on the recording, but I managed to turn it on before the discussion, which is better than nothing. So nobody needs to hear the introduction over and over again anyway.
I can voice a couple of things that stood out to us at Arizona State. One thing that was interesting to see was one of the workshops at the beginning of the conference was around broadly accessible quantum computing, which was kind of a new step for PEARC. I hadn't seen any representation from that community at PEARC before. So that was interesting to see. One of our staff presented there. And the other one that sticks out most readily is in the systems and software track of the conference. There were a few folks presenting papers about their systems, about the supercomputing capabilities, right? Advanced research computing capabilities. Clemson had a talk that was quite interesting that I remember, Notre Dame and several others. And I hadn't seen a ton of that before, specifically about systems. Here's a way that we can publish interesting things about our systems, what we're doing. Clemson had an interesting upgrade path for I forget what the system was called, but for one of their clusters, and provides a way for them to have researchers cite the system easily to kind of aid in tracking utilization and in communicating to leadership. Having a paper, PEARC provides a good platform to have a paper about your system, about your capabilities that can be cited by researchers, that can be shared with leadership. We were happy to see that.
Anybody who wants to speak up, just unmute and go for it. I'm going to try to stay muted and force you all to talk.
I have a question. Since I'm going to be PEARC25 chair, is especially so strategy and policy facing people. I'm wondering, what do you go to PEARC for? And do you find that there's spaces at PEARC for like strategy and policy facing content, or should there be? I'll just be quiet from there and see.
So one thing I noticed, I didn't get to go to PEARC this year, but last year there was this leadership workshop that was useful. So maybe having something of that sort at PEARC would drive more people in this role to join PEARC.
I'll jump into. So the RCD day, the breakout on the storage was actually tremendously helpful, because we were talking about sort of very common storage problems that we're facing across many campuses, large and small. And so, you know, some of the challenges are really related to strategy and policy. So that was great. I would like to see more. But for me, a lot of it is, you know, some of the ways that I think about strategy have to do with going to papers and listening to what other people are doing, so we can be thinking about how we might pilot test some new things or where we might need to grow some skills. So I would say there's a lot of benefit on the strategy and policy side, but it would be nice to see some additional focused, potentially a couple of focused areas. Sure, would love that.
At Nexus Day this year, there was the first steps towards thinking about data governance and how we bring folks together around that. And, you know, I had a particular interest in that, although thanks to certain IT issues, I missed that workshop. But you know, we're trying to figure out some of the data governance issues around the PEARC, the data we collect here at PEARC and as part of our PEARC activities. And so I think there's some campuses that are further along with this, but that's one that I hope we can continue to pursue and bring the community together around. In part, I think that CASC is a great place for leadership of larger institutions and big centers to meet. And they sometimes talk about these things. I think what's nice about PEARC is it gathers a somewhat broader community around this stuff. And there's great, you know, we can collaborate nicely with CASC, but PEARC is an opportunity to broaden that community a little bit. And I hope that we can bring together the insights of small institutions as well as large institutions dealing with some of these issues. So.
So, and I misspoke. I think I was referring to the data governance, but the table that I was at, the group I was working with, we were a lot really focused on the data governance side on how do we manage all the data with the storage aspects of it. So yeah, it was a great workshop.
Yeah, I'm bummed that I missed it.
Something I'll add on that note is that the data facing track formed several months ago a data storage, just like a little casual discussion group that looks like it's likely to become a full interest group in the near future. And so for those folks who want to talk specifically about data storage, there will be a place to do that.
I think
fact-
Dana, go ahead. Speak, please.
Oh, sorry. I realized as I was finishing up, and not quickly, that I can drop the Google group in if folks want to join that.
One more thing, Dana, that might be worth thinking about for PEARC25. There are probably some strategy and policy facing aspects that could be incorporated. One that comes to mind is finance. I don't think we have a financial facing track. We probably don't need one, but that's a huge part of my responsibilities is the financial things. Capital planning, data center planning, some of that kind of dips into systems, but not so much on the technology aspects as the how do we pay for things? How do we ramp up costs? How do we effectively utilize power and cooling, especially in Arizona? All of that kind of stuff is interesting, and I don't know that there's exactly a home for that super exciting financial aspect of strategy and policy. But the other reason that I like to go to PEARC is because there's so much stuff that isn't strategy and policy, right? So that I can get caught up on what's going on in systems, what's going on in storytelling and user support, and what's going on in all of the facings and areas that I don't live in day to day anymore.
Especially for the folks who weren't able to go, from the people who did go, what were some of the most interesting keynotes or talks or BOFs or whatever else, beyond what we talked about with Nexus Day that you went to that you thought were really interesting? Maybe people could go and look up.
I think that I saw a talk from Harvard about cold front and how they're implementing, providing or building on top of that for our modules. It was only a 15-minute talk just because that was the format. I wish it would have been able to go longer. One of the things that I found difficult with the 15-minute format was it takes a while to walk to and find the talk. And then by the time the 15 minutes is over, it's very quick. So you would have to follow up with that person in that team to if you wanted to implement anything out of it, because the 15 minutes just isn't long enough to kind of explore on your own. And then, if you need to go to a different talk, you've already missed the next 15-minute talk by going. So I think the format, for me at least, was a little bit too short. I think I would have preferred longer talks, even if that means less talks, because usually when I go to a conference, I'm only taking back like 3 to 5 nuggets of information that I can actually implement in my institution, within a given period of time. So you do have to prioritize kind of when you get home, what are the things that we are actually going to work on and implement. So I think I would have preferred a longer format. The other thing that I'll mention is for next year, I would really like to see talks, especially plenaries from outside of our community. It was really nice to see folks lifted from within our community this year, but I think in order to push us outside of what we talk in this circle, there are some of us who go to CASC. And so a lot of it, I think for some of us who have been around for a while, there were talks that were repetitive. But I would like to see something like fresh and new for next year.
Suggestions are quite welcome, Jackie.
I see you on the call, Dana. That's why.
I like that suggestion, but I will also say that the keynote panel about the actual infrastructure issues around supporting AI and machine learning was I thought a really great.
Yeah,
It
positive
was kind of
comments from that.
amazing.
We had a similar panel at CASC. And so for some of us, it was a little bit of a repeat of information. But it also was a scramble to put that together. So, you know, I can appreciate people stepping up. But I think a mix, right? We want to see ourselves, and we also want to see something that inspires us to think outside of this community that we are already engaged in.
I mean, it's interesting because what you were saying about, you know, the number of talks going on, it's one of those things about PEARC growing up more, that it was both much more competitive to get a paper accepted this year, which meant there were a number of things that were only accepted as short papers, which have even less time to present. And the challenge of fitting that into a schedule, I think you're absolutely right, Jackie. There's a real tension there between getting enough and getting a chance to talk to people, and trying to have a fair amount of content. This was the first year where I felt like most of the week, there was something I wanted to go to most of the time. And in many cases, I was having to make hard decisions between several different things because I really wanted to go to several. And that's great in terms of how rich the content is, but it's really frustrating at the same time. And there's just way too much to have a single track conference. So, Catherine.
Jackie, I definitely agree that, you know, it's almost as if seeing something organically starting out as a seed at the spring meeting, and then having the positions working group work through it over the next, you know, few months in preparation for the final paper and present. This is the first time we've ever done that as an organization, is present in the technical program in an official sense, so to speak, although we've had a lot of CASC members participate in PEARC. So a lot of lessons learned from that, definitely. I was completely amiss in letting the audience know that this group had been working on this for months, that it wasn't a last minute shuffle to put this together, of course. But I mean, ultimately, there are a lot of things I learned from PEARC. A lot of them I'm going to take home, that I've already taken home, and we're going to try to implement some things I probably shouldn't say publicly. But definitely a learning experience.
We do everybody appreciates that. For those who weren't there, one of the speakers had an issue that forced them to withdraw at the last minute. And so we had to find that. And I thought it was a great replacement, even though I was really looking forward to hearing that speaker. She was a good example of somebody who wasn't necessarily, you know, part of our regular suspects. And I was disappointed that she couldn't show up, but these things happen.
So hi, I'm Elizabeth from Northwestern University, and I work on Jackie's team. When the team members, I did not attend PEARC. When the team members who did attend PEARC from Northwestern came back and did kind of their summaries or takeaways or trip report, one of the things that I asked about was if there was a project management track, because I'm a project manager in the group, and if not, might there be an opportunity to maybe institute some type of a project management in future PEARC conferences? So that would be my thought.
Elizabeth, you're not the only one that's brought that up. So it'll definitely be in the discussions for all sorts of the RCD community that aren't quite represented clearly yet in the CFP.
Okay, great. Glad to hear it. Thank you.
Sometimes when there's you know, affinity groups like that are interested in trying to find one another and get started, a great way to do that is to propose a birds of a feather session at PEARC, and it, you know, then you can gather like-minded people and begin to say, okay, well, what do we have in common, and you know, how could we do something together? And you know, maybe you have an idea for an interest group or something like that. So
great, thank you.
what other talks?
I just wanted
boffs or anything did people hear that were really good? Sorry, Jackie.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, since it was going to help fill in the space, but the networking opportunities at PEARC are always just, I think, the best part about PEARC. You can, one of the things that I like to do is attend the talks that are interesting and then follow up with those folks. And just, I feel like, sorry if you can hear construction noise. I just feel like the community at PEARC continues to get even more and more welcoming and inclusive. I feel like we've moved and really grown in a lot of ways as a community, and PEARC is always the one that I see so much change in the makeup of the attendees. I think 60% of the attendees were first-time attendees, and I think this is a real opportunity for us to continue to grow this community and workforce. So I also heard great things about the student program. And I know that's kind of like biased because Albert from Northwestern was chairing that as well, but really, really great opportunities both to mentor as a professional development opportunity for your staff, and then to send your students to.
Is there anyone on the call? I see one comment from Dave Mellor. Is there anybody else who was a first-time attendee at PEARC who's willing to share impressions?
I'll speak up. I was a first-time attendee. I'm at St. Louis University. Some of the systems track, I wasn't really anticipating finding them as engaging as I did, systems and software, but the one around HPC container management, I thought was quite interesting, and certainly things that I would hope to maybe implement here at SLU. And some of the talks around sort of documentation and making documentation easier. One was from Clemson, because our documentation is there, but it definitely would be nice to have better documentation. I don't know that you'll ever reach a point where the users can find everything they want at the documentation, because they do actually have to read it first, which is, you know, behavior that I can't force. But in any case, I found those were not things I was anticipating as being as engaging as they turned out to be.
Come on, folks, don't be shy. This is a welcoming community.
I've got my hand up, and so I'll go. I also heard and share sentiments that PEARC has really become increasingly inclusive, and that there's a very different set of folks who are showing up in all the right ways that I think PEARC is wanting to be inclusive. One of the things that I also heard too, and going to the point of the fact that we have project managers who are showing up, we have folks in roles like research data librarians who may not identify so strongly with the HPC moniker, right? And like not everything that gets discussed in research computing data, all the stuff that makes this work is not all HPC, was that maybe thinking deliberately about avoiding the sort of one-to-one alignment of PEARC with HPC would help with that inclusivity and making folks feel welcome who don't necessarily identify with being an HPC professional, perhaps. I was just wondering if others had thoughts related to that. And full disclosure, I probably should have mentioned earlier, I'm a new member on the steering committee for PEARC. So also keeping an eye out to pass insights into the steering committee discussions.
I think that's an excellent point, Lauren. I think it's reflective actually of a maturity that I've been advocating. I think we're seeing some advancement in the community to recognize that research computing is about supporting research, and scientists tend to have data, right? There's cloud resources. There's a lot more to accomplishing science than the next big computer. Not that that's not important for some science, but we are supporting research, and there's a general broader mission. I think you're absolutely right that, you know, there's a reason why we use, you know, RC rather than HPC.
And depending on your institution, you know, when I was at Berkeley, we called it research IT.
Yeah.
And some people are a little more allergic to IT, but it was because, you know, it was not just HPC by any means. It was desktops and data and networking and security and all these things. So
there's a mission that we're also adjacent to this with our interactions with the EDUCAUSE community, and some of you are familiar with some of the joys and tribulations of that interaction. But I think there we bring it even a step further of, we're sort of the advocates for the RCD community into the rest of IT. And I think that RIT moniker is useful for making sure that can happen too.
yeah, personally, I would love to see us take more advantage of EDUCAUSE that way. And because we're not getting a lot of CIOs and other kinds of like EdTech professionals coming to PEARC, not surprisingly. It's, you know, they've got other conferences and everybody has to make choices about what conferences they can go to. Like I think it's great to have more data librarians. They have to choose between RDAP and PEARC and various other things too. But I think that we need to find a way to, especially like for the folks involved in the leadership side of things, strategy and policy stuff, to share stories and figure out how to do a better job of making the case to CIOs and understanding where, you know, especially as you have more computationally and data intensive instruction, connecting more to the folks who are on the ed tech side and making sure that we're serving that as well, because it's not just research anymore that needs to use these kinds of facilities.
Thanks to Dana and the rest of the CAR community, I gave a talk at our, it's sort of a regional EDUCAUSE thing. It's scaled like EDUCAUSE, but for the Commonwealth of Virginia in March. And half of that presentation was introducing, this is all IT professionals, you know, a handful of research folks, you know, the capabilities, but the facings, ideas, and CARC as an organization. But I think we've got something to offer to the general higher ed IT community with the facings model, because that's a useful way of thinking about the naturally eclectic nature of higher ed IT. I think in RCD, we sort of bring that eclecticism to its extreme, perhaps, but I think there's, you know, it's something that grows naturally out of the way that a lot of higher ed IT folks see themselves. And that provides an opportunity for us to, again, bring that inclusive nature to our peers over in IT and let them see that if you kind of dig that eclectic side of IT, by the way, there's a home for you where we relish at that.
Yeah, kind of one of my other questions, kind of like, do we need to be more deliberate about avoiding too much alignment with HPC? But it's a different one that goes to that education component is, you know, is it time for PEARC and maybe even entities like CARC to be more explicit about the fact that we're really talking beyond research computing and data resources to include education use cases, academic research computing, and what other monikers make sense to represent that education academic component as a complement and now necessary component of what we provide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the student experience, and I think the pedagogical example of undergraduate research experience is an excellent one to riff off of for broadening the mission while staying true to, this is about research computing, but there is a broader mission of our academic experience that leverages research computing in the breadth of higher ed. I agree.
Well, and in a lot of smaller and mid-sized institutions, you've got senior leadership or trustees that see the mission as primarily instruction and workforce development, and then secondarily as research. And they don't appreciate it when you're selling everything as just research. And if you're making the case that, look, you can't teach data science, you can't teach AI, you can't teach ML without these kinds of facilities, that's part of why we're doing this. You make a much better case to that leadership in terms of supporting your program. And I'm half tempted to begin calling it, more like R&E, computing and data, because it really is becoming essential to the instruction mission as well.
We'll sign you up for banner administration soon, Patrick.
Well, it's funny, just before I left, we had a really interesting project going on where when they were trying to scale up Data 8 at UC Berkeley, which was, a huge Jupyter Hub instance, and they were trying to figure out how to connect it to data that the students could hold on to beyond the scope of the class. And then, how do you provide instances of scalable Jupyter notebooks that would tie into the cluster, and realizing, it's one thing to just put up Jupyter Hub, it's another thing to integrate it with AutoGrader and, other course systems and all these other aspects that the instructional side are really familiar with, and most of the research side are a lot less familiar with. On the data side of things, we had this dream that someday a student would arrive and we would say, this is your data space, and it will stay with you throughout your career, and you will be able to attach it to every class you're in and take advantage of it so you don't lose anything as you move from class to class and year to year. And figuring out how to do that was entirely non-trivial, but I think, it's the kind of thing that's got to link across all the different things that we do.
Jackie, that's a great question, I think, about whether we should have a compute-facing group for that. It's, thinking about safe spaces, there's still going to be HPC people that, also want to get together with like-minded gearheads, I think. So having, as we become increasingly more aware of the broader mission, then we're going to have some of these specializations, and not thinking of HPC as the default research computing experience means, and it also creating a space for that to happen. I think that's a great idea.
And to answer your question, Jackie, about, would it make sense to do a compute-facing group rather than assuming it's a default of researcher and systems-facing? As people network co-coordinator, this is something we've talked about among our people network track coordinators for some time, that none of those is intended to be specific to computing or compute-specific researcher-facing or systems-facing.
When we create like researcher facing and systems facing, there's an assumption that compute is included in those because that's how we started out. And when we don't call out compute specifically, it kind of says like, we're all assuming that compute is the default. And so like places like PEARC and CASC, my data science people and data management people don't assume that those spaces are for them. So without calling it out specifically, just continues to say like, you're the majority. And that I don't think that that's the case for all institutions anymore too, because some institutions choose to use Access, for example, but then have data management people as their primary team members. So I think I'm not looking for an answer. I'm raising that there's a perception that HPC and compute is the default, and in order to move away from it, I think that we need to say this is going to be compute, and then you don't have to attend those if you're not in compute. But going to a researcher facing talk, for example, like if we didn't know the topic, there's folks who could assume that they're all compute.
I think you're absolutely sorry. Researcher facing it needs to be default, absorbing the research experience. Yeah, I think it's worth kicking the question over to the systems facing peers and say, what do you think? Are you all still getting enough, HPC and storage? I don't want HPC people to not get more storage exposure. So I kind of like that, systems does hit both sides of that. But I think that's a really, really good question for the systems facing group is, do they feel like they should have a compute versus non-compute? So not non-HPC centric
Yeah, the sense among the co-coordinators and in the discussions they've each had within their tracks is, to both of your points, that computing and data are an integral part of supporting research and the types of education use cases we're talking about, which is why they want and have been trying to foster discussion in the tracks that is not just computing, but if there's still a perception that they're computing specific, that is something we need to address.
I think we need to hear from the data science folks and the people that aren't attending. Because it's if it's compute people or compute focused people, they may not have the perspective to be able to provide feedback that is inclusive of the whole community that we're trying to capture and support.
Yeah, hearing the feedback that the perception is still computing specific, there are definitely things I think we can do among the co-coordinators and the steering committees for the tracks to make sure we're being more aggressive and explicit.
Jim.
Yeah. So can you hear me okay? I was having trouble with my camera. Okay, great. So I would say that, you know, I've been on the systems steering committee for about 2.5 years now. I would say probably a third of our calls are specifically like HPC oriented. And we try to do once or twice a year, you know, where we invite researchers in that actually use the systems and explain how they help their work or augment their work. And we try to coordinate that either with the data facing or the researcher facing group to kind of, you know, pull those people in that wouldn't normally come to a systems facing talk, because I think you're right that it's somewhat off-putting that people assume that all we talk about was like, what's your latest, greatest cluster, you know, describe it to me. And so we've also talked about workforce development, and we've talked about a lot about data storage, and not specifically HPC data storage, but data storage in support of research. So, you know, I would say that's good feedback to hear, and maybe we should be a little bit more explicit when we put out the call doc each month, because we're usually the latest, you know, on the call. So we're usually the latest getting our call doc in, but we should be a little bit more specific about what sort of audiences it might appeal to. Thanks for the feedback.
Jackie's point in this discussion also reminds me of something else that I've been chewing over for a while. And then one of the great things at PEARC was running into some of the US RSE folks, the research software engineers. And they're focused primarily on that aspect of developing software for research. And in the People Network, we've said we don't have a software facing track because, you know, we don't want to be overlapping with them, and we want to coordinate well with them. But there's a lot of folks involved in HPC stuff that are doing optimization and porting and performance monitoring and all this stuff that doesn't exactly look like what many RSE folks understand themselves to be doing. And we aren't really providing a forum for them. And that's a big part of most folks who are running, whether it's HPC or cloud stuff, because the cloud architects, again, they're not exactly RSEs. They're sort of systems people. And I'm not sure what to do about it, because I certainly don't want to undermine the good relationship we have with US RSE and all the good work that they're doing. But Jackie, I don't know, when you think about HPC stuff, is that some of it? Like, you know, do you think of it primarily as the folks who are on that systems facing side, or what about all the people who are doing all that software stuff that most researchers frankly can't do but depend upon?
And this is just speaking from my experience, my team, what they see. That I think they do see themselves as software engineers, right? But it's not exactly the same type of stuff. When you hear RSE, I think of something else, because that's a community that has defined themselves in that way. Again, I think because historically HPC has been around for longer, they haven't had to define themselves. And I think they're getting left behind a bit, because they do software optimization, right? They do develop software. We have people who develop software. But I think that not only to stop assuming that compute is the default, but also to not leave them behind and create spaces for them that aren't. So I think the variety is great. And I think that the exposure is important, but there's going to be spaces where they don't want that dilution, right? So that they can focus on their HPC stuff.
So thinking about this slightly differently, since most of the folks on this call are people in leadership positions, so who do you think from your team should go attend PEARC? Or who do you encourage to go attend PEARC? That would define the audience that we as the leadership group think that is being served by PEARC, right? So what are people thinking when they think their staff member is going to PEARC?
For us at Arizona State, PEARC is the one conference that I want to send almost everybody to, or at least every service area. Engagement facilitation, software folks, lots of systems folks, students, people like me, whatever I do, and all of the other leadership kinds of people. We send almost everybody. Secure and regulated folks, we send them as well. The only folks we didn't send this year were the project managers, and I'm kind of scratching my head about that. Maybe we should have done that also. But because of the broad representation and you get a real clear picture of what this community is and is about and where it is going. And that's valuable to us because we have folks coming from lots of different places, people coming from formerly libraries or formerly enterprise IT. If you want to understand what we're about, PEARC is where you do it. So we emphasize broad coverage.
How many of you think explicitly of attending at PEARC to be either professional development or staff retention strategies?
Both,
but also there's the risk of people getting scooped up at PEARC, and we are guilty
there's a
of
lot
that
of
too.
scooping at PEARC. I think also just knowing where your peer institutions are at and what other people are doing. So so in a service development perspective, not just professional development, but also leveling up your department or team or services as a whole.
So one thing I noticed at PEARC, this is my second time attending, there does seem to be a lot of, everyone wants to know what everyone else is doing. And of course you go to talks to learn that and stuff, but I was wondering if maybe there could be set up like a survey system where people could submit questions about what they wonder other groups are doing. And that could be something that could be answered PEARC wide, during PEARC. And then people could all collect the information and learn things from the largest group possible. It's just something I noticed happening a lot during the conference, of just people asking questions and picking up on things that other groups are doing. So that's my thought.
One of the sections at EDUCAUSE a couple of years ago when I went, they had was the, bulletin board meetup type thing where you'd get two to six people gathered around the table on top, and you just post on a bulletin board, times you were going to be there. And it was a relatively formally organized thing. I forget the company that set it up for them. That might be the kind of thing that would be able to riff off of something, what Brian is suggesting too, to provide a place to meet and greet where someone, and the experience that I had at EDUCAUSE 19, actually where I met my current boss, Brian Enzer, talking about getting scooped. But we had Brian and me on the one hand, and these two individuals who had just been told by their leadership that they were going to start becoming a research university. So you go solve that research computing problem. And so it was a really rich conversation opportunity for that really intense mentoring, and that format is really, really good for that, and would, I think, provide an opportunity for that kind of interaction.
I'm wondering, Brian, did you get to go to any of the lightning talks that were the abstract only bits? Because it kind of seems like that could be a forum for some of what you're talking about. It was one of those things where because of the scheduling, I didn't get to go to hardly any of the lightning talks, and I was really curious how that track went.
The student talks? Or
No,
something else?
I think the idea was that the folks who did the abstract only track were going to they were supposed to do really short presentations of their abstracts. And in choosing among tracks, I didn't get to those, and I was curious how that went.
I think there was one track where the talk seemed quicker than the rest, and that just made it harder to see them. I did try to go to some, and I think it was basically, yeah, this is something I need to look into more, but it's hard to get much out of it at the time.
Yeah, maybe we need a different way, almost like the poster sessions where we're trying to gather everybody together. So it's more single track at that point, because it is really hard. If you want to hear like 3 of them, to Jackie's point, you can't be running back and forth and trying to catch a couple of those.
Right.
Yeah, I would say I was a little disappointed, but I went to a couple of Lightning Talk sessions, and it seemed like, and it might have been because of the IT problem earlier, but it seemed like a lot of the presenters didn't show up, and then you really can't tell the next person to go, because people that are managing their schedule knows that starts at 11:45 and not at 11:20, so they'll miss the talk. So I mean, I think the session hosts or the moderators did a nice job, keeping them on time so that people didn't get screwed up on the schedule. But it was a little disappointing to the one that I went to where my friend was he gave the 3rd talk, and the 2 people before him didn't go at all, or didn't show up. So that was, we were waiting around for, 25 minutes or whatever before that person spoke. So I don't know if you can do much, because I think the first day of that, it was because of the plane scheduling and everything like that. But so I don't know if you can do much about that. But I thought the moderators made the right choice by not letting the next talk go early, because if you were managing your schedule, like Jackie said.
I will also say, to Brian's point, when we've done different workshops over the past several years related to some of what you're talking about, sort of what are people doing, what people often say is these discussions are really great, but what I would love is if you could capture this somehow. I need to see the story, and I need to be able to take that story back. And we've talked about trying to find a way to facilitate that within PEARC, and part of it is trying to find folks who are good writers and interviewers. It's really kind of an exercise in science journalism almost, where we want to find a way to do a better job of capturing the stories, and then building a sort of repository of stories about how you did certain stuff and a new project you took on. And it's kind of like what we're doing with PEARC and all the papers, but it's more narrative and less of a research paper format. And this is one of those things where we are continuing to look for funding to support that aspect of what we're doing, because I do think it's a really nice idea. I think everybody wants to hear more about what other people are doing. They want to know, okay, well, how did you actually do that? What were the processes? How did you make it work? What challenges did you face, and things like that? And people say they really want those stories. They want a repository of them, as well as things like, can you give us an example of if it was a survey, if it was an impact report, if it was a strategic plan or whatever. So.
I mean, one thing I like about PEARC is the pre-planned networking sessions that help a lot by having lunches provided on site. Like, people don't go out, and that gives a formal opportunity to interact with people, like, to don't waste time and so on. So that's a good thing, and I hope that continues.
Well, we're running up to the top of the hour. Are there any other closing comments or questions or feedback from anybody before we wind this up today?
Thought I might also mention I'm in Minneapolis, cohabitating with a bunch of librarians this week, and at a summit. And to the point about the data facing and extending that reach, the PEARC data facing group got a few mentions. This was a bunch of ALR and CNI types getting together to talk about data management governance, to the topics we were talking about a few weeks ago, right? And but Susan Ivey was there, so using an opportunity for she and I were able to riff off each other to bring forward the, and by the way, as y'all are looking for places to get together, we have some friendly PEARC types that like to talk about data facing things. So that was well received by that group.
Nice, that's great.
I've got something. You all are invited to the cask reception next year.
Yay.
You had to add half a dozen tickets.
Well, consider I've lived in Columbus for 30+ years. So as Dana knows, I know the ins and outs. So I'm really excited about next year.
That is great.
Cool.
Catherine is the Columbus champion.
Right.
It was her idea to do the video that we did.
Yes.
I don't know if
That
everybody's
was
seen it.
fun.
It was well done.
The
That
video
was
is
great.
great. The video is just, it's fantastic.
No.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unless anybody else has any parting shots, thank you all very much for coming and contributing to the discussion. I hope everybody got value out of this. Please do take a look at the link in the chat. It's a really short survey just looking for feedback on future topics. It's a simple form, just poses some topics. We're looking for comments and suggestions or feedback on some of the topics proposed and other ones that you might think of. So if you can take a few minutes at some point in your day and fill that out, that would be really helpful. And other than that, thanks everybody, and hope the rest of your week goes well. Hope you're not someplace that's getting flooded with rain or baked with heat too much. So take care of y'all.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.